think we're recording, so no heckling, please. And I put a tie on. I had to remind myself how to tie a tie this morning. It's such a long time since I put one on. So go this way or this way. So the life and works, as Rodrigo mentioned, are summarized in this amazing book. And I'm not going to try and cover all of that. It would take 24 hours or more. So I'll just pick on certain highlights that illustrate the title, Taking Risks for Peace. And just maybe suggest that we can also take risks for peace in big ways and very small ways. Hopefully inspired by Father Moon's life. And I think the first slide shows the current situation of Korea, which is divided still after all these years. I think at the end of the Second World War, there was a provisional, because there was no government, many people in exile, so there was a provisional arrangement between the superpowers that was supposed to be temporary until a more formal arrangement could be decided on, but actually it's still divided. Incredible, after all these years. And we'll return to that map in a little bit, but as most of you will know, when Father Moon was born, even when his wife was born in 1943, Korea was under Japanese colonial rule. A very harsh, brutal regime, particularly for people of Christian background. And in his early life, that just shows, you just get a feeling from that picture of the frugal type of lifestyle that people had. I remember going there in 1981 for the first time and seeing still very much a very simple kind of situation there, people living in a very basic type of life. And it's amazing the leap that's been made in South Korea until today in terms of economic and social development. But Father Moon pictured here, then in his early life, he, in terms of taking risks for peace, he would always stand up to bullies in the village where he lived, in school. Even if they were bigger than him physically, he would always stand up if for sort of righteousness, if he saw unjust treatment of his friends or whatever. That was in his basic character, his basic nature. So I'm just going to highlight certain things from his life and throw in 2 or 3 personal stories for good measure. When he was about that age, 15 by Western counting, 16 by Korean counting in 1935, as detailed in his book, he describes how he had a very deep spiritual encounter with the divine, with the Almighty and with Jesus, and he felt called to work for peace, world peace. And he felt that calling was almost too much for him to bear, what he was being asked to do. When he saw the state of his own country, the state of the world, the Cold War as it developed, it was just almost too much. But anyway, he said he would try his best. And one of the first things he did was, during the Second World War, to go to Japan, to the so-called enemy nation, ostensibly to study science, but also to try to understand the mindset of the so-called enemy, the Japanese people who were occupying Korea. And he studied a scientific topic, electrical engineering, partly to understand more the world of science, which later on he used to try to bring together and harmonize science and religion, particularly through something called the Professors' World Peace Academy, that some of you will be familiar with, which started in the late 70s and early 80s. I'll just mention that again in a few minutes. And he graduated from the university in Japan in 1943, but while he was in Japan, he associated with people who were working towards Korean independence. And so he was under surveillance because of that by the Japanese authorities, both in Japan and back in Korea. So that was taking a big risk to identify with such people. And in fact, it earned him an incredible, brutal series of tortures, one of which was called the dancing crane torture. This is back in Korea when he was arrested. You can see strung up with your hands behind your back and beaten with wooden sticks, almost to the point of death. And the first reading came just after that we heard Natasha read. But somehow he survived that torture, and then he went on to try to fulfill this calling, particularly in the beginning reaching out to the Christian churches who had established themselves in Korea. And in 1946, he felt somehow called by God to go to what was then North Korea, which, if you think about taking risks for peace, was not necessarily a death sentence, but he knew that he would encounter incredible opposition. Of course, ostensibly from the regime in North Korea, which was a communist regime with their version of communism called Juche ideology, self-reliance. But also in Pyongyang, many churches had established themselves, and he encountered opposition from other churches and other denominations, because he started to attract a lot of people, particularly young people, to himself through his charisma and his teaching. So as a result of that opposition, both from other churches and the regime in North Korea, then he was initially again tortured, virtually to the point of death, recovered from that, and then he was sent to a death camp. And you probably will know something of North Korea, the harsh brutality of North Korea. If they don't like somebody, then your days are numbered. And that was true in his case. So he was sentenced to prison, I think 5 years in prison, which was basically a death sentence. Most people survived less than 6 months. About 3/4 of people would die within 6 months. It was that brutal. Overworked and underfed. So supper was, as it says, a handful of boiled grain and salty soup, digging huge mounds of fertilizer and putting it into bags, and people would even die while they were eating. And reportedly, others who were sitting close to them would even take the grains of rice out of their mouth after they died, because they were that desperate. That was the reality of that particular. But anyway, he survived 2.5 years, 2 years and 8 months, and he was liberated from Hungnam prison by the United Nations forces. 16 countries sent forces to Korea, and the day before he was due to be executed, the North Koreans didn't want any witnesses to what had happened, so they were gradually executing the prisoners. But the day before he was due to be executed, he had his number. He knew that the next day would be his last. They had to dig their own graves. They were shot and buried. The UN forces attacked Hungnam, and all the prison guards and officials fled, and he was able to come out. And he returned to Pyongyang for 6 weeks, 40 days, and then went to the south with all the people who were fleeing there from the war, trying to find refuge in the south. So he understood very well what it meant to be a refugee. He travelled down to what's now South Korea, to the very tip of South Korea, a place called Busan, a major port in South Korea. And there that's just the map, he and his wife were born here in what's now North Korea, just in that part of North Korea, in Jeongju and Anju province. But after he was liberated, then he had to travel all the way down to Busan, in the very tip of South Korea. And there he built the first establishment, the first, I don't know what you would call it. What would you call it? A hut, a shack. outside of Busan on the hillside, made with rocks and stones and ration boxes, just enough room to lie down inside. And there he started to speak, again, very charismatically, and people started to come. They were attracted by this strange man on the hill who spoke for hours on end, and he spoke about the future, and he spoke about world peace. And not only world peace, but he spoke about all the nations of the world eventually coming to Korea. So you can imagine for the people who were with him, it's a little bit hard to believe that that's going to happen. When you're in this shack, this mud hut, with rain coming through the roof, and in those particular circumstances. But in the intervening years, that actually started to happen. In the 80s, especially in the 90s and the 2000s, then groups of people from around the world, Christian ministers, people of different faiths, academics, started to come to Korea to conferences. And the ultimate example of that was in 2020. Some years, of course, after he passed away, 8 years after he passed away. But it was probably, arguably, the largest delegation of people we will ever have coming to Korea, and certainly the most diverse. I don't think we'll ever have anything like that again. The people who were there, from United States congressmen to ordinary mere mortals like myself, just could not believe the diversity of the people. There were 120 current and former heads of state, people of all social status, every kind of background you can imagine, under one roof. It was incredible, just unbelievable. But it started with the prediction in that little hut all those years earlier, 60, 70 years earlier. And it happened about a week before COVID really hit. It had already broken in China in December. This was at the end of January, beginning of February. 2 weeks later, and we could not have had that gathering. Literally 2 weeks later. And we had to check on everybody who was there when they went back to their countries. Our representatives had to check that all the people who went back didn't get COVID. And nobody did out of those 5,000, incredibly. I would say that's almost a miracle, really, almost a miracle. Our delegation from here in the West Midlands consisted of, some of you will know Sheikh Nuru, one of the most radical Muslim people, certainly in Britain, in the best sense of the word, one of the most radical. Malachi and Julien from Rwanda, Christian minister. Harmahinda, he's the European director of the Sant Nirankari. Kuldip, the national director of the Namdari Sikhs. And Jatinda Birdi, he was the vice chair of the Interfaith Network UK. So quite a substantial delegation. And they just could not believe what they were experiencing. Sheikh Nuru, he worked born in Ghana, but he worked in Kenya and then South Africa for 6 or 7 years. And he met at this conference somebody he just couldn't believe when he saw him, Prophet Samuel Radebe from South Africa, who he knew when he was working in South Africa. So all those kind of encounters were just happening all over the place. It was amazing. I remember sitting at one table for a meal, and this United States congressman came and sat next to me. A US congressman just came and sat next to me, can you imagine? And I started talking to him about Birmingham and the percentage of Muslim brothers and sisters here, the number of mosques we had. And he just couldn't relate, he couldn't understand, he couldn't connect to that from his background. He just couldn't get it into his head, you know, the kind of diversity we have in this city. Just a couple of other little things, and that's just gives you another glimpse. Our little delegation there we were somewhere in the middle of all of those people. Sheikh Nura wanted a picture with the little angels. Many of you will know the little angels. And they gave this incredible performance. Beautiful, deep, pure-hearted performance. And he wanted a picture with them before he came back. So we managed to do that on the way out. And this, another encounter of the most amazing kind. This young man, Olivier Gravron, some of you will know him. Then he came on the last evening. We had a banquet, we were sitting around our table, there was one chair free, So he came and sat next to Julien from Rwanda, and they started chatting. It turned out that Olivier had been on a project, a youth project, making a road in the village where she was born, right by her house. Can you imagine? And they came and they sat next to each other on the final banquet evening. Amazing. Just gave us goosebumps, that kind of encounter. Anyway, I digress a little bit. So in between 1951 and 2020, and so many things happened to expand the foundation to the worldwide level so that that could take place, but it involved taking all kinds of risks on the part of Father Moon and Father and Mother Moon. All kinds of risks. Some of them literally putting their life on the line. In order for that to happen, Father Moon felt he needed to go to other countries, and particularly America. He felt America had a crucial role to play in bringing about world peace. That God had somehow founded the United States of America, but America was losing its way in the 60s and 70s, particularly in relation to its young people. So he went to America, initially was fairly well received, spoke publicly in many places, but then he encountered, again, opposition from some of the Christian churches and denominations, but particularly from the left-wing ideologues in America, one of whom was called Congressman Donald Fraser. So he always took a very strong stance against communism as an ideology, not against communist people, but against communism as an ideology. And because of that, then he encountered threats to his life on numerous occasions. And in America, this Congressman Fraser brought charges against him of having not paid $7,000 in taxes because public money was kept initially in a personal account when our movement was setting itself up in America. And more or less at the same time, President Bush owed about $100,000 in taxes, and he just repaid it. But because of Father Moon and who he was, then he was tried and convicted. He left America, and the indictment was pronounced when he was out of America, so he didn't need to come back, but he came back to America in order to serve that prison sentence. Even there, putting his life at risk by going into prison. But he felt that that was his calling, and he would serve that. And while he was in prison, then many people came to see him, many of the professors and Christian ministers who knew him, knew about his work and had taken part in our activities. And one in particular was called Professor Morton Kaplan. And he was responsible for this Professors' World Peace Academy that was set up. And in prison, Father Moon said to him, the Soviet Union is going to collapse. The Soviet Empire is going to collapse. We need to have a conference that announces that in 1985. And Morton Kaplan said, that's just a no-no, we can't do that, He had, all the academics had their credibility and their status, we can't say that kind of thing. He probably didn't believe it himself. But Father Moon insisted. So in Geneva in 1985, we had a conference, The Impending Collapse of the Soviet Empire. And a few years later, the rest is history. That's what happened. The Soviet Union just disintegrated, and it was difficult to explain how it happened. But Father Moon felt it was going to happen, and it needed to be proclaimed, even though, again, it would attract opposition. When he came out of Danbury, then he was feted. This was a gathering of particularly Christian ministers, about 1,700 ministers and other people gathered, and there was the God and Freedom banquet to welcome him out of prison. He came out like a hero, especially from the Christians, and he, in the process, united the left and the right. So Dr. Joseph Lowry, who gave the prayer at President Obama's inauguration, he was from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, very liberal, and I haven't got a picture here, but Dr. Jerry Falwell, he was very much on the conservative right of Christianity. But they stood together on the same stage and welcomed Father Moon, so he could bring together the diversity of Christian denominations when he came out, and was feted and lauded for his time in prison. Fast forward 5 years to 1989, then again a personal anecdote. Just before the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Patricia and myself, we were living in America, and we would go on a Sunday morning to this particular place called Belvedere in upstate New York to hear Father Moon speak. And on this occasion, there were some garage doors out behind here, double doors that were open. And towards the end of his speech, he said to us, he pointed out of the double doors and went like this. He said, "You have no idea how fast things are going to change from this moment on." And we all sort of looked at ourselves, what's he talking about? Didn't know what he was talking about. But within 2 or 3 months, the Soviet Empire disintegrated. So he had that sense of, the prophetic in him, that it was going to happen, it was going to happen soon. But rather than lauding the collapse of the Soviet Empire, he felt we should actually go into Russia, and many of our members at that time, then in 1990, went to Russia and started a program of character education for young people to try to fill the vacuum left by communist ideology. Some of you I know went there. I went there myself. It was just an incredible experience. And he himself went there in 1990. 3 years earlier, in 1987, our family was living in New Jersey, and there's a quite famous road, north-south road, called the New Jersey Turnpike. Some of you who've been in America might have travelled on that. And there was still a lot of opposition, left-wing opposition, particularly from the communist world. And on the New Jersey Turnpike in 87, a car was stopped at random, seemingly, by the police, and they checked the driver and had a look in his car, and they found in the trunk of his car a pipe bomb, and in the car itself they found a list of addresses that Reverend Moon lived at. And it was a Japanese Red Army terrorist who was looking to assassinate Father Moon. And he was found seemingly at random by the police, and fortunately that didn't happen. But that's the kind of opposition that Father Moon attracted because of his stance for righteousness, and in this case against communist ideology. And there were rumors that President Gorbachev and Kim Il-sung were actually behind that initiative, that they dispatched a number of Red Army terrorists to try and assassinate Father Moon. So can you imagine if you are in his shoes and you know that that is the situation, you know that there are going to be attempts on your life? How do you live your life with that kind of feeling? Incredible. I think most of our members would testify that when they met Father Moon and heard him speak, a lot of the time he would be smiling and radiating and giving. But given this backdrop, how on earth he did that, literally God only knows. So he felt, coming to a conclusion then, that he needed to meet both Gorbachev, and as we read in the second reading, he needed to meet Kim Il-sung. He just felt that calling, that he needed to go into the enemy camp and somehow meet the people, in spite of the risk involved. So in 1990, we had a large conference in Moscow. Not quite sure how it was organized, but Father Moon went there with his wife and a number of dignitaries, some current and former heads of state, media people, and President Gorbachev came, and they were able to meet him, and actually Father Moon developed a friendship with him that lasted for some years. But he told him very clearly when he spoke to him in his office, actually, you must allow religious freedom in Russia. He said that to him very clearly. Which started to happen. Later on, things somehow didn't work out too well, and some reactionary forces and former people from the conservative wing of communism, including Vladimir Putin, came back into power, and also the Orthodox Church re-established itself, and there was some kind of relationship with the establishment, the Orthodox Church and the government, and they wanted to get rid of any kind of organizations or new ideas and reestablish reassert their authority. So all the work that we'd done at that time, our members had to leave, and we couldn't continue that character education. It had actually gone into about, I don't know how many thousand schools by that time, but unfortunately it was stopped. I think we'd have a very different Russia today if that work had been allowed to continue. We would have had a new generation of young people with a very different mindset coming into positions of responsibility. Anyway, that friendship endured even after President Gorbachev left power, and he attended a number of our meetings. But it began with that risk of going into the enemy camp, the former Soviet Union, on that occasion. And the final ultimate risk-taking venture was in 1991, about a year later. I'll just mention a couple of other examples of risk takers that you're familiar with. So Nelson Mandela, when he came out of prison, you may have heard, he tried to leave all the negative feelings he had towards the establishment behind, and he wanted to bring all the people of South Africa together. Even he was opposed by some members within the ANC, African National Congress. But he said no. So he became the president of South Africa, and his concern was for the whole of South Africa, black, white, brown, Asian, and so on, which is the parental heart, we would say, the heart that wants to include and embrace everybody, which is what Father and Mother Moon have always encouraged all of us to try and develop, that heart, that inclusive heart that wants everybody to be within the one embrace, as in this room today. And the other person, of course, is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who uttered these famous words: "We never get rid of an enemy by meeting hate with hate. We get rid of an enemy by getting rid of enmity, the feeling of enmity. That's the only permanent solution." So when we see what's happening now in different places in the Middle East and so on, there's a lot of work to do. But that kind of thinking and that mantra has always been Father and Mother Moon's guiding principle, to get rid of enmity and being willing to take risks in order to make that happen. So finally, my final picture then is Father Moon meeting with the very person who had committed him to that death camp, who had him tortured in 1946 and then committed to Hung Nam death camp. He wanted to meet that person before he died, before Kim Il-sung died and before he himself died, and somehow try to reconcile. So he prepared for a long time to meet with Kim Il-sung. There was no guarantee he was going to meet him, even by going to North Korea. But he went through a lot of internal preparation, saying that when he met Kim Il-sung, he wanted to try to have no feelings of enmity towards this person and treat him like his older brother. And that's what happened. If you read the encounter in the book, he was in North Korea for several days, and when you arrive in North Korea, you have to sit at the table and receive Juche ideology. So he had about a 1 hour or 2 hour lecture on Juche ideology, and at the end of it he said to the people on the other side of the table, "May I say something?" And they said, "Okay." And another time I'll show you the little video clip of that time. So he stood up, Father Moon, and he just denounced Juche ideology in very strong terms, banging on the table. And if you know anything about North Korea, and the people on the other side of the table were absolutely not just gobsmacked, but scared out of their wits that they'd allowed somebody to say this kind of thing. And Father Moon knew that probably Kim Il-sung was listening remotely, but he still spoke his mind. And somehow Kim Il-sung seemingly said, "I want to meet this person who dares to come and say this kind of thing, on my territory." But his wife and the people with Father Moon, part of his delegation, they just thought, that's it, we've had it. We're not going to get out of here, even alive. So he put his future, his family's future, his movement's future on the line to speak what he felt was what God wanted him to say. And through that he was able to meet Kim Il-sung some days later. And I haven't got the picture here, but he actually ran towards him and gave him a big bear hug, which nobody does. You don't do that in North Korea. And the security guards behind Kim Il-sung jumped back like this. You can see in the photographs. But he embraced him. Kim Il-sung received that, and he called him Kim Il-sung elder brother, and they had a very congenial conversation, and several projects then began as a result of that meeting. And also it opened the way to diplomatic relations between North and South Korea, which happened quite soon after that. So my point today then is that example of taking risks for peace, if we feel so inspired or called by God, by the divine. And it can be as big as trying to meet some big shot person and speak about peace, or it can be just in your local community, just engaging somebody in a conversation. Maybe you have somebody you don't get along too well with on your street, or just meeting somebody on the way to work and walking and giving a smile. It could be anything. Just taking that little risk for peace in order to bring more harmony and reconciliation. I'll just leave you with one of the best modern examples of that. They're called the Bereaved Families Forum, or the Parents Circle and Families Forum. They are Jewish and Palestinians who've all lost an immediate relative in the conflict over the years. They've lost a son or a daughter, a father, a mother, and they decided, rather than resort to violence and retribution, they've made an association of 500-600 families, the Parents Circle and Families Forum. And they go into schools, two people, one Jewish, one Muslim, one Israeli, one Palestinian, and they talk to the young people about peace and about the future, that violence begets violence. Violence is not the answer. And try to help young people to think in a different way. Having paid the ultimate price of losing an immediate relative. And you have nothing to say in front of these people. You can only weep. Incredible example. We're going to need those people when the conflict. And we might try to invite them here again. We invited two of them about 17 or 18 years ago now, in 2006, 2007. They came to Birmingham. They spoke in schools, the university, on the media, in newspapers. And we may try to invite two of them again, so watch this space for those amazing people. So I hope that gives you a little bit of inspiration from Father Malamu's life, and a little bit of courage and hope for the future, that actually, regardless of the situation now, which is quite dark and quite bleak, we, you, I, me, you, we can make a difference. And it starts at the local level. It can often start just one-to-one. As we know, Tom mentioned earlier, peace starts with me. Right? Peace starts with me. So please take that with you out into to your family, to your workplace, into schools or the wider society, and let's continue this work together for peace and harmony in our world. Thank you.